Hello and welcome to She Leads Collective podcast. I'm Mary Gregory and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is a space for honest conversations about what it really means to lead as a woman today and how we can all show up with more courage, care and clarity. You'll hear from inspiring women, powerful allies and bold truth tellers who are changing the game, not by playing tougher, but by leading smarter, softer and stronger. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the She Leads Collective podcast. What happens when our identity intersects with the stories we're told about leadership, about who belongs and who doesn't? Well, my guest today is Dr. Rob Sayers-Brown, who is a chartered occupational psychologist and principal consultant at Kiddy & Partners, and whose doctoral research explored women-only leadership programs. As a gay man in a heteronormative professional world, and that was quite a word to say, Rob brings a powerful personal lens to the topic of inclusion and exclusion in leadership development. With a career grounded in psychometrics, group facilitation and talent consulting, Rob has worked with organisations to develop leaders, often against the backdrop of deeply embedded narratives about gender, power and belonging. In this episode, the intention is that we will explore the question, are women-only leadership programs a solution or part of the problem? And how do our social identities help or hinder the way we see ourselves and are seen as leaders? So let's move to Rob straight away with a very warm welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. It's perfect for this podcast, actually, because this is all about gender equity. I also, as a coach and facilitator, as you know, run women leadership programs, women only, and have a very clear reasoning behind that. So I'm really curious to hear what has come through in your research. Part of me is a bit anxious, actually, Rob, in case it says, oh, you mustn't do women-only leadership programs. But let's see what emerges from this conversation.
Absolutely.
I'm trusting the process.
Absolutely.
Anyway, let's start with you first of all, though. Can you tell us a bit about your career journey and how, what led you into organizational psychology and what you're doing today?
Absolutely. So I've come to this party of occupational psychology relatively later in life, actually. I started off my career really in retail banking and was a branch manager for a number of years before moving into project management. And it was when I was a project manager at Penna, actually, who, the organization that we both know so well, where I really started to fall in love with the idea of understanding what makes people tick at work, and was supporting a fabulous bunch of occupational psychologists in their work and was bitten by the bug right then. So got myself qualified in a number of psychometrics, did my master's in occupational psychology, did another master's in psychology after that as well.
So
and
two
then
masters.
two masters, and then did my professional doctorate in occupational psychology 2 years ago, it was now. That really just, it embedded really why I got into this field in the first place, which was to support people, to help people thrive. I think a large part of my career, a golden thread, has always been about people, but also, Mary, I'm very nosy as well about people.
That
and I
helps.
think that exactly. And I think that has served me well in my career. And certainly the doctoral journey has been both a personal and professional reckoning, really, in some ways, and I'm sure we'll dig into that. But yeah, I couldn't see myself in any other field.
Oh, it's
really,
fantastic.
than what I
So
am now.
I'm getting a sense of you're just feeling fully aligned and
Absolutely.
also fulfilled in what you're doing.
Absolutely. I think I walk away from each day knowing that I've made a difference, even if that difference is small. I often say that if I'm able to help an individual have the penny drop moment about how they're showing up and why they're showing up in that way, and what could be getting in the way sometimes for them, that for me is a job well done.
Fantastic. And some of the things you're saying, you remind me, I had another guest, Dr. Louise Austin,
Mm,
on a few weeks ago, and she talked about her PhD, and what she got from the end of it was this, she obviously delved into a topic very deeply, which you have done as well. But
yeah,
actually, what came out of it for her eventually was there's so much I still don't know. Did
yeah.
you end up with that sense for yourself?
Absolutely. I walked into this journey thinking I'll get my doctorate, I'll be the oracle, I'll know everything there is to know. And that so isn't the case. If anything, it's made me even more curious about what is happening now and supporting up and coming psychologists in their own research and practice. But that real enjoyment of digging in and understanding what's going on here is another kind of piece that drives me, I think. So the doctorate has absolutely added fuel to that
Yeah,
fire.
and the real depth nature of it is what I'm
Yeah,
hearing. Because
absolutely.
so often in this world, and particularly in the world of psychology as well, people are looking for quick fixes.
Yeah,
And actually, the whole depth piece is so important because actually that's how you create sustainable change is
this
to
is
go
so
deep.
true.
Yeah.
So true. And, a lot of the organizations that I work with, and I absolutely get it, there are limited resources. But let's say we're designing a leadership development program. Um, this shouldn't be a conveyor belt of modules that won't make the learning stick. Let's understand what's really going on. Let's take the time to understand what are the development needs. Because if we're designing a program and let's say a module is about leading with empathy, if you've already got leaders who are really empathetic, why? Why would they need that program? Let's focus on the things that are really going to matter and shift the dial for them, which is why I think a training needs analysis or some type of assessment that just helps people understand where their strengths are and where their development areas lie. Let's use that measurement to inform the program that follows. And that's where magic happens because it's tailored directly to those needs rather than just being a whistle stop tour
Yeah,
of
or an
a variety of topics.
off the shelf
Exactly that.
solution which isn't necessarily designed for what you're needing there.
Totally.
Yes.
Totally.
Okay. So, but your work is around leadership identity. So what
Mm.
inspired your interest in that? And
Oh,
specifically in researching women-only programs as well?
yes, absolutely. And I suppose the focus on women-only programs is twofold. I mean, first, I'm a gay man, and at some point in my career, I really started to wonder how much of that part of me influences how I lead and the strengths that I bring to the table. And more importantly, why do leadership development programs never talk about that facet of my identity? Um, and I've attended a few programs over the years, some great, some really quite forgettable. And I'll be honest, they did equip me with some skills and tools and frameworks that I can use, but rarely, if ever, did they really acknowledge how my identity shaped how I showed up as a leader. So that was really the first part. The second is that I'm a brother and a son to two fabulous female leaders. And I've often heard, secondhand from them in terms of the kind of clandestine, innocuous comments that are sometimes made about their gender and how they're showing up and what the impact of that is, and having to navigate a world that really wasn't built for them. So it was twofold, really, coming both from very, very personal places. Um, but if I link it back to the first point around me as a gay man in the leadership sphere, I was so frustrated that there wasn't a great body of research around the LGBTQ plus community in leadership. And it felt as though that it didn't matter. We didn't matter. And I think that was a really kind of confronting notion for me, particularly that, with what we're seeing at the moment with the massive backlash around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the States and also here in the UK now, given the High Court's ruling on the very narrow view of gender. It felt even more important to support my community and to fight against what feels like a systemic and systematic erosion of our identity. The message that I wanted to send is that we matter, and here's why. And so I'm hoping that this research has kind of added to that voice, because my doctorate focused on both women-only leadership development programs and what works, what doesn't, what are the key topics and concepts that are really impactful, and then try to apply some of those learnings to the LGBTQ plus population, because, as I say, there was limited research that looked at LGBTQ plus in leadership. And the great thing is that there are some synergies that find that the individuals on women-only programs find really beneficial, that actually my research for LGBTQ plus individuals in leadership also found really useful. And the way that I kind of reconcile that is that women leaders, LGBTQ plus leaders, their paths to leadership are very intertwined. Both of those paths kind of challenge the very narrow, gendered, heteronormative views that we as society have of leadership. So homophobia and misogyny come from very similar places, which is about ostracizing those who don't fit the mould. And so my research was almost double whammy in those senses, looking at women-only programs, but then shifting the lens to LGBTQ plus leaders and what could be used from that already established body of women-only research to think about how we could apply that to a different underrepresented group. The results were fascinating in that sense.
Okay, we'll dig into those in a minute, but I
Mm,
just want to check because you talked about your mum and your sister and the
mm.
biases that they experienced. Do you feel as a gay man you've experienced similar biases?
Absolutely. I feel as though that certainly very early on in my career, and now, Mary, we're talking like 20 years ago, and thankfully things have shifted in the positive, I think, overall. But there were certain things very early on in my career where I felt as though I had to cover. I had to mute aspects of myself to be able to navigate those biases, and to put myself and to almost remold myself into something that would be more acceptable for others. Um, and so, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there are things that come to my mind I where there was suddenly silence as I entered into a room, or that even when we were out socializing, and this is many years ago, out socializing with some work colleagues, and someone said to me that lager is a gay drink, and that's actually that stuck with me even 20 or so years later, because it's so foundational. I felt personally attacked. I didn't say anything at the time, of course, because, as I say, you're trying to mask these aspects of who you are. But the fact now that you and I are talking in 2025, and that is still in my memory, I think just goes to show how deeply that stayed with me and struck me.
And that is such a great example of a throwaway comment
Exactly.
with someone totally unaware of their biases and how they
Yeah.
might be impacting somebody, but picked up by you and held by you for many, many years. And I get a sense of what you're reminding me of is, back in the 80s and 90s, I can remember big shoulder, as women, big shoulder pads, trying to make ourselves look bigger. And that was all the trend at the time. But also the whole superwoman thing that women were trying to emulate the way men were in order to get ahead. But actually, things
Exactly.
have shifted, thankfully, because there is now, it's much more about holistic, and actually, women bring a different quality, as a gay man probably brings a different quality to the table to the average sort of heterosexual man. And it's like, how can we blend all these different elements? That's what diversity is, really, is making the most of all the
Absolutely.
different qualities that, whatever our gender, we
Yeah.
contribute them.
Absolutely. And I think, like we talked about, things have shifted, thankfully, over the last sort of 20 years or so. But I think there are these prevailing views, particularly prevailing views of leadership, that still prevail. And I'm sure that you've seen the wheel of privilege, which puts all of those characteristics that are closer to the center, like white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical, all of these aspects, all of these kind of identities closer to the center of this wheel are the ones that get access to the power very, very easily. And with power comes leadership positions. And those, as you come further out of the center, LGBTQ plus individuals, female leaders, the neurodivergent individuals, these individuals have to work harder still to get access to roles, resources. And it's this societal context that is still very much prevailing and still holds a lot of weight, actually, around who gets ahead and
Yes.
why.
Yes. And of course, when you get ahead, when you get into those leadership roles, leadership is influence.
Yeah,
So you then have the influence, which I think is part of the reason it's so difficult to shift the system,
absolutely.
because those people that you describe that are at the center of that wheel of power get the
Mm,
power and
yeah,
therefore sustain it.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And with that, I think there is an aspect of advocating for people who are similar to those individuals as well. So ultimately, what you have in a very broad brush sense is white, able-bodied, neurotypical, heterosexual men advocating for other white, able-bodied, neurotypical, heterosexual men, which then starts the cycle again, which means it's even more challenging for those outside of the center to get access because they are having to constantly justify even why they are in the mix when it comes to things like leadership. So again, working even harder to get the same level of recognition and power and influence and sway.
Yes. It's exhausting. That's what I
Yeah,
get. It is exhausting, which is, I suppose, why, you know, the shift is towards how can we shift the system rather than supporting women to fix themselves or gay men to fix themselves. It's actually the system that needs to shift in some way. Although I still think there's validity for women only programs as well, which we'll come to
I
in a
agree.
minute. But
Mm,
let's move into that. So you've done in-depth research into how leadership identities are shaped. What are
mm.
some of the key findings that came through your PhD?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I think our if we think about leadership and what makes a leader, certainly through my research, what emerged was two aspects of capital, human capital and social capital. So human capital really are the internal resources a leader brings, like their competence, their clarity of purpose, psychological well-being, and a sense of leadership identity. Um, and I think for many underrepresented groups, authenticity, because authenticity is a large part of that leadership identity, authenticity is a luxury. They aren't always afforded. So societal and organizational expectations often force those who don't fit the mold to suppress or edit parts of themselves in order to be taken seriously. And over time, it's that can erode self-belief. It means that we have to increase our self-monitoring. We're always aware. And often too, it can reduce the behaviors that are essential for good leadership, like confidence, resilience, and adaptability. So that's really human capital, and leadership identity forms a large part of that. And then we have social capital, which is just as important, really, but often even harder to access for those who are underrepresented. Social capital is about who you know, who advocates for you, and how visible you are to those who make decisions. And it includes things like our networks, our mentors, our sponsorship, all of the relational infrastructure, let's say, that helps leaders grow. And in dominant leadership spaces where social capital is built, it's still built really based around traditional norms of masculinity and heteronormativity. They and by that I mean they tend to favour those who already fit the societal mould. Again, often men, often white, already in the room. So when women and LGBTQ plus individuals, especially those who don't align with those dominant identities, try to build that capital, they're not just networking, they're navigating dynamics which really subtly, and maybe not so subtly, question whether they belong there at all. And that means that there's less access to both of those forms of capital, those stretch assignments, those opportunities to be seen, and even fewer champions really willing to advocate for us when it comes to things that matter the most. So human capital and social capital were two kind of really key concepts that emerged from my research. But this point around leadership identity was the thing that stood out for me in terms of what is one of the really beneficial concepts to explore within these programs. How can we create the space for individuals to really ask themselves what makes me who I am as a leader? What identities do I possess? And rather thinking about those as a barrier to progression, it was about looking at the intersection of those identities, and from those intersections, what strengths were emerging from those, and how can I use those to support me in wading through the treacle that is the societal and organizational context that puts me at a disadvantage? How can I lean in to those strengths to help me navigate that path? And that was really the concept that stuck with me, that really came to the fore, I think, in terms of, the key topics that emerge that really support participants of these programs.
Okay. And so how have you applied that in those insights that have come through? Because they sound quite heavyweight to me, and
They really
very,
are.
very, very deep.
Yeah, very, very deep. And so, part of our, well, I've tried to operationalize this in a really practical way. And, I think the academic versus practitioner divide is something for another time with a large box of wine. But I've tried to operationalize these in a very practical way so that they make sense for participants on the programs that Kitty and Partners produce, where we create that space for people to really pause and check in with themselves and create what I've called an identity map that puts them at the center. So much so that they draw a circle and write me in the middle. And then from that, really consider what are the identities that I possess, both in terms of gender, ethnicity, social identities even. And from that, then too, we're going further. We're thinking about what are the values then that I have that emerge from having those identities in my possession. If I am a carer of someone, does that mean that I perhaps feel as though I've got higher levels of empathy? Or if I am a gay man, have I gone through life knowing that I am different to the heteronormative space that is this world, so that might give me resilience? And then from that, even further, thinking about from the intersection of those identities, the values that come with them, what are the strengths that I've got in my possession, both recognized and unrecognized, and how can I use that within my leadership, particularly when I feel as though I'm challenged or having to navigate waters that are full of crocodiles, let's say. How can I use those and lean into those? So we take a really practical way of exploring that, but also thinking about, okay, going forward, how can I use these strengths that emerge from my identities in a more deliberate way?
I'm quite inspired by what you shared there because it sounds like a really rich process for someone to go through to actually
Mm,
look at what are the different identities, but then the strengths focus of that. Because so often
yeah,
we don't even think about ourselves,
no.
and we just keep on going, sort of thing. And to actually have that time to reflect on the many different roles and identities you take in your life, and what strengths and values come out of that, sounds
Mm.
like a real gift, actually.
It, I'm always real. I have goosebumps when I see people being able to see themselves more clearly and have that sense of clarity. And and I think reframing their their struggles, and not to discount them at all. This isn't about discounting those struggles, but it's recognizing that um, strengths emerge from the fire, and they're forged in fire, really. And what we often forget to use is that aspect of reframing, to think about, this is what I've gone through, but how could I turn this on my head to actually think about what are the strengths that emerge from that, and how could I use them more deliberately in my leadership practice?
Yes, fantastic. Okay, let's move on then and have a look at the reflection on women only programs. So, you know, do you think women only programs reinforce gender difference or help redress the power balance? I suppose that's for me is the $1 million question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a large part of my research really looked at the fact that these programs can't exist in a vacuum. Um, and certainly part of operationalizing this in a very practical way is that alongside our own program at Kiddy and Partners, we have a set of modules that are for line managers and advocates that really help them to recognize the power that they wield, and power not just from being in a leadership role, but typically from their own identities, which means that they're starting further ahead than those who are on one of our programs. So, really helping to reinforce this message that as a leader, but also as someone in possession of characteristics that have a greater weight in society, how can they channel that in a way that is a ally and a supporter of those who are underrepresented? Um, and so that runs alongside our programs as well. But the program in itself and women only leadership programs are absolutely vital because of all those things that we've talked about in terms of the societal context that makes underrepresented groups in general kind of question, well, I don't belong here, or what can I bring to the table? They absolutely have a place for us to explore more deeply what makes me uniquely me, and how can I use that more effectively in my leadership to support me in that uphill struggle that exists because I'm not in a possession of those characteristics that society deems as really impactful. How can I lean into those? So, it certainly, in my view, and the research that I conducted and the participants of the the programs that I reviewed found that these type of programs have a place in helping them recognize and celebrate their strengths in a world that doesn't celebrate
That
them.
sounds so positive, and I'm so glad that's the that's what came out because certainly my belief is that the reason I'm a real advocate for them is that women just find it so much easier to talk freely when it's a group of women. And if you include men in that conversation, it tends to reflect the
Absolutely.
dynamics of what goes on in the organization, and women don't feel so able to talk freely. And I think that
Yeah.
ability to just open up, but also the whole thing about recognizing
Yeah.
authentically what you bring, your contribution, your strengths, and the impact that has
Mm,
on the organization, really, really powerful.
absolutely. I think, the space within women only leadership programs is, and a lot of this rides on the strength of the facilitator here too, is to create that space, to hold that space for people to share. Um, because they'll have very different lived experiences. Of course they will, but they are united by one being, that they are a female leader. And so that kind of united nature of these programs is such a powerful moment for people to dig in, be vulnerable, explore, self-discover, and it's that makes these programs so important.
And I love that you've got the context of, allies and line managers and the people that support the women on the programs having their own program going along in parallel to that. So they are better at the end of the day, they'll be more enlightened leaders.
That's exactly it. And I think, the focus on those sessions is around intersectionality. A concept that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw around kind of systemic issues within ethnicity. And, we use it within the lens of leadership. And what does this mean for those who are underrepresented, but also for those who are represented, who are the leaders and managers of these individuals on the programs. So it brings into sharper focus their privilege, ultimately, and how to use that and channel that in a way that is going to uplift others rather than hold them back.
So, you mentioned having sort of allyship programs going alongside a women's program. How can we design women's programs to make sure that we don't inadvertently reinforce the idea that women need fixing?
Exactly that. And we are aligned on this, and I know this because you've used the word fixing. And I think often, like I mentioned, as a gay man, certainly it felt as though my sexuality didn't matter when I was on leadership development programs, or even worse, it was seen as a distraction. But I think leadership is gendered. Leadership is gendered, and we have to recognize the space that gender plays in leadership. And so when we're designing these programs, we need to recognize that. We need to recognize the societal and organizational context in which we're operating. This can't just be about fixing the female leader and supporting them in acting like their male counterparts. Of course, there will be certain foundational leadership skills that will be important, but that is in the absence of gender. Things like confidence, networking, conflict resolution, all of these things are important for leadership. But to root them with a gender-based lens is key when it comes to women-only programs, as well as taking this lens of intersectionality as well to help people understand how their identities are showing up and how they can lean into those. I think often when it comes to women-only programs, certainly what I saw was this fix the women approach, which was very frustrating. But I think if we're embedding core principles, and certainly at Kiddy and Partners, ours are intersectionality, which we've already talked about, and being able to understand those identity dynamics, but also linking that with positive psychology theories, which is the strengths-based lens here, to help people navigate that path more effectively. Additionally, I think there is a key aspect here of acceptance and commitment therapy. And I don't really like the word therapy because it sounds very clinical. And of course, it is a clinical practice, but acceptance and commitment coaching is what I would call it. And there is a particular module within our program that looks at, now that we've identified what our identities are and the values and strengths that really emerge from them, how can I use that as my guiding light, my North Star, when I'm in those situations that really challenge me? And that's what acceptance and commitment coaching is. It allows us to move towards those things that we truly value. Again, being authentic in that way to help us navigate those muddier waters. And in leveraging acceptance and commitment coaching, we are supporting our participants in building their resilience, their confidence, their sense of self, again, to help them navigate those contexts that put them at a disadvantage. So I think it can't just be about giving tools and frameworks for an individual to use, it has to go deeper. It has to go deeper. It has to go below the surface so that the participants walk away from the entire journey with that real authentic confidence about who they are, what they bring, and how they can lean into that in those moments of challenge.
I'm loving this, Rob. Thank you so much. It's resonating massively. And I've got a question which I
Oh,
can't resist asking,
sure.
which is, as a facilitator and coach of women
Mm.
on women programs, I'm curious, what would you want someone like me to consider or rethink?
Oh, what a fabulous question. I think it's going to be around the what we've touched on. Actually, no, it's not. It's not around that, Mary. It's around the access to these programs. Now, this was something else that my research looked at, was who and how gets access to these programs. And across many of the studies that I reviewed as part of my research, one of the most consistent barriers was the recruitment process for these programs itself. Programs often prioritize formal criteria like tenure, length of service, seniority, or their academic background. And whilst they might look like fair measures on the surface, they actually don't tell us much about the person's capacity to grow or their potential to lead. And what they do reflect is privilege. Of course, who went to university, who didn't, who's been here longer, who hasn't. And what's often overlooked are the qualities that matter most for learning and development: ambition, curiosity, self-awareness, interpersonal skill, drive, the stuff that doesn't always appear on paper, but that shapes someone's ability to stretch, adapt, and lead. And what was really frustrating reading the articles that I reviewed was that it was a tap on the shoulder nomination, or made behind closed doors based on those aspects of tenure, seniority, academic achievements, etc. So what we've got here is a really significant takeaway, and something that I would encourage all developers, facilitators to advocate for, is if we want our programs to be inclusive, start by making the selection criteria inclusive and transparent. Widen that criteria. Look for predictors of growth, not just social status. Because without that, we are just reinforcing barriers to development.
So, what would be a predictor of growth?
So, what we would be looking for are, and again, leaning on the academic research here, when we're looking at learning transfer, someone's desire to learn and grow, we are looking at things like drive, curiosity, self-awareness, interpersonal skill. Again, some of those things that aren't always visible, again, for the underrepresented group, because we aren't always visible. So how can we objectively measure that? And the best tools for that really are those best-in-class psychometrics, something that can give us some insight into those characteristics that fuel potential growth, rather than just relying on this tap on the shoulder, archaic methodology, subjective, exactly that. Let's look at the real things that predict someone's ability to learn, and then apply that learning in new contexts. And that really comes back to aspects of personality and thinking style.
Okay. I shall go away and think about that then with regards to my own programs. That's very, very helpful. So let's just move on a bit about your own personal identity, because you are very open about being a gay man and the differences you've experienced through your life and through your career. You've been very candid about it. How do you think being a gay man has shaped your perspective on leadership?
I think it certainly has made me more resolute that I have a place within leadership. And I think it's also made me recognize that I have valuable strengths to bring to the table. I'm no longer apologetic about it. I no longer take a a covering, masking approach. And I understand that I'm very privileged that I can say that as well. But because, of course, we live in United Kingdom where there is much more acceptance around the LGBTQ plus community. But I think certainly for me, it's recognizing that the strengths that are forged in that fire are something that I bring uniquely to an organizational context. You know, as a gay man who has to or has had to constantly scan the environment to make sure that it's safe to be me, and to understand the dynamics that are at play there. I feel now as a leader that I can be quite shrewd and empathetic. I'm very careful around the dynamics that are in the room. Of course, it has strengthened my resilience as well, I think, because I've had to go through certain things where I've been challenged and I've been attacked either in a very underhanded way or a very visible way. And I think it's also giving me a real sense of ambition and drive again too. It's made me want to move forward, but also to fight for others to be able to move forward as well. And I think too, in the second part of my research, that looked at taking an intersectional lens to leadership and LGBTQ plus individuals and exploring how they came together. A lot of the individuals that I interviewed talk about that coming together as a collision, which sounds very violent, actually, doesn't it? But I think it just shows the weight of those two identities and the energy that is released when they do collide. And so I think from that collision, it's made me realize through speaking to the participants of my study that there are strengths that come from that adversity. Things like I've talked about: ambition, resilience, empathy, which then means that I am trying to support other people who might be underrepresented. I'm trying to advance other people as well who might not have had a voice before, or I'm trying to create a level playing field in terms of justice. If I see unfairness, I will call that out. And the more that I listened to the participants of my study, the more that I recognize that is my view of leadership, in the fact that it isn't one-dimensional. Leadership is multidimensional because we as human beings are multidimensional, and we need to learn to use the strengths that come from the various collision of our identities.
Yes. I hear it's really strengthened you as an ally and advocate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's, as I say, it's come from a very personal place. But professionally, it's made me grow and recognize that as a human, as a psychologist, as a gay man, that these identities come together and manifest in me wanting to support those who, like me, have been underrepresented before. And that really brings us full circle to why this research kind of existed in the first place, and why I went down this path to give a voice to those who are, from a society perspective, potentially seen as voiceless.
So I think we've already talked quite a lot about the parallels between women and LGBTQ community and professionals. But what are some of the differences?
I think this is where perhaps visible and invisible identities come in. And, you know, when I said that I come to this conversation with a lot of privilege, I mean that because I am white and I am a man. Those are the things that people can immediately see. And I'm also very tall as well. At 6'2", I can be quite imposing, and I recognize that. But what's invisible here is my sexual identity. being a gay man. And I think that is the key difference here. Is if we take those kind of characteristics, let's say, for female leaders, it's gender is right there.
Yeah,
Um,
you can't
you
deny
can't
it.
deny it. You can't deny it. And I think that is a stark difference. Of course, is that identity is very visible, um, and which means that perhaps if I was a straight man, maybe I would be thinking about things in a slightly different way. But because of having that invisible identity of being a gay man, it's made me even more acutely aware that I do have a lot of privilege because that identity is invisible. Um, and of course, with that visibility that comes with being a female leader or of a or of having an ethnicity that falls outside of that white sphere, that's another very visible identity that can creep in and pose an additional barrier ultimately. So that for me is the key difference, the visible versus the invisible.
Yes, yes, very good. Okay, let's move on then to just consider moving into the future. What do you think a truly inclusive leadership development program would look like for you going forward into the future?
I think the first part is recognizing, for one, that an inclusive organization is a thing of fairy tale. We're not just going to arrive and poof, we are an inclusive organization.
If only it was that
Oh,
easy.
if it was. Um, but I think organizations will always be political and always working towards being an inclusive organization because we as human beings, we have biases. As a society, we have biases. So unless those biases change, which won't happen, that would be a miracle.
It won't happen
It
overnight,
won't
that's for
happen
sure.
overnight, exactly. But I think because we are, as a human being, we are innately faulty in the way that we are wired because of our biases. It will always be a continual journey rather than be a destination to be an inclusive organization. So I think we need to recognize that context too. I think a development program that focuses on the core principles of intersectionality and positive psychology for the participants of those programs is key, but also creating enough space for them to be able to focus on their well-being as well. Like we've talked about, acceptance and commitment coaching can be really helpful because, like you yourself, Mary, said, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. So we need to support and heighten participants' own internal resources to support them through that journey, but also supplementing whatever journey that we produce with some support for those who are leading these individuals, for those who are advocates and allies, and understanding why their voice, their power, their privilege is so important to help those who are underrepresented. That for me is where the magic happens, and where things are encouraged, i.e. a strengths-based lens to really celebrate and utilize those strengths in a way that feels incredible.
We're totally aligned on that. I really think a strengths-based approach is so
Mm,
the way forward. And we mentioned at the beginning how this is tough times
mm.
for diversity and inclusivity at the moment. Lots of organisations are cutting back on their budgets. What's one shift you think an organisation that is serious about equity in leadership, what's one shift you would recommend they take?
Oh, what a brilliant question once again. And I don't know if I would just be able to stick to one. So I,
Well, I suppose my take is what's the smallest thing that would have the biggest difference is another way of looking at it because it's got to be doable and easy to implement.
and I think a lot of organisations that I work with, I don't think there's a great deal of maliciousness in this, but I think there is we're an inclusive organisation. Of course, we're an inclusive organisation. We value everyone. I think we need to stop peddling this narrative, instead reframe this to say we want to be, and we recognise that we're not currently. We've got pockets of brilliance, but we've also got pockets of things that aren't working, and we're looking to address those. But being honest with people, because otherwise it becomes almost like a false promise. It feels performative as well. So I really think confronting this narrative to say, we want to be, we're not there, and we recognise that.
So what I'm hearing is you're inviting the organisation to be authentic about where it is around gender equity.
Yeah, authenticity breeds authenticity.
It does.
So let's not try and cover
so let's not pretend that we're
not
there, because we're not.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what gives you hope right now in this space?
I mean, it's, as we've talked about, it's a very challenging time, I think, within this space. And it's frightening, Mary, if I'm honest too. I think what gives me hope is speaking to organisational sponsors who care deeply about this topic and supporting underrepresented groups. They're not giving up. That gives me hope. Because it makes me recognise that we're not in this alone, that we do have, despite the headlines, despite the posts that we're seeing across social media and this backlash, people who are sponsoring these programs, sponsoring equity, diversity and inclusion, they're not giving up. They're fighting the good fight. And for me, that is the hope. That is the hands around the candle, protecting it from a very strong wind. And I think if it wasn't for them, I would be steadily losing hope.
Yes. And you are one of them.
I am one of
Rob,
them.
I know everyone who is everyone who's involved in enabling gender equity and parity, we are all part of that community in some shape or form.
Absolutely. And I think we need to stick together. We need to share our insights, our knowledge with each other. Because if we don't, then we're just reinforcing barriers that already exist. So collectively, we need to support each other to tear them down.
Yes. Well, Rob, you have shared some fabulous insights and lots of depth in today's conversation. How can people connect with you?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest, I would say, or emailing me at rob.sayersbrown@kiddyandpartners.com. But yes, please do reach out and let's fight the good fight together, because it's so needed, particularly in this day and age.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming and spending your time with me today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Mary.
Before we wrap up, I want to share something with you. Do you ever feel like your confidence isn't really the issue, but wish you could strengthen your ability to deal with things that keep chipping away at it? The bias, the double standards, the pressure to prove yourself, to name just a few. That's exactly why I created Exploding the Confidence Myth, a 3-month programme for women leaders who are ready to change that story. It combines one-to-one coaching, group coaching, and a powerful in-person workshop. The next programme starts at the beginning of November, with the workshop taking place on the 7th of November at the Connaught Rooms in Holborn, London. Past participants have described it as validating, supportive and stretching. They've become more visible, raised their value, increased their financial return and broken through patterns that have held them back. But perhaps, most importantly, they've gained a deeper sense of okayness with who they are, recognising they already have something valuable to offer. If this resonates with you or you know someone who would benefit, you'll find all the details in the show notes. I'd love you to join us. Thank you so much for listening to the She Leads Collective podcast. If this episode resonated with you, follow the show or share it with a friend and leave a quick review below. Or leave us a comment. Change happens through conversation, so let's keep this one going. Listen out for the next episode and join me as we keep lifting the lid on the stories that matter. Take care and keep leading with heart.